Welcome back, everyone. For those of you who saw my intro video, I am Austin Rebel, owner of 2F by C Tactical, here in New Prague, Minnesota. We're a gun shop and avid Second Amendment firearm supporters. And I've wanted to do this for a while to educate people on specific gun control law in the United States. With that being said, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the constitutionality or not on these laws. The bulk of this episode and the preceding episodes on the individual gun control acts in American, this past American legislation. We're going to talk about the history of the time, what it means, and why they were doing what they were doing. And then we'll talk a little bit towards the end of how it impacts us today and whether or not we should be talking and removing it. And now, with all this being said, before I can hear all the angry comments, I want you guys to know that I am a strong, staunch Second Amendment supporter. At 2F by C Tactical, myself personally, gun control is unconstitutional. It's that simple. Doesn't matter what it is. And even if it was constitutional, it clearly doesn't work. You know, they always say that if you don't like murder, just outlaw murder, right? Well, we did, and it didn't stop anything. So the reality is we need to talk about the nuances in this. And that's what the purpose of this is the education of people on these individual acts. And there's some really interesting things, doing some deep dives in the histories of this, of these individual acts, especially the NFA, that isn't necessarily common knowledge and is, I mean, at least me, being the nerd I am, found rather interesting. So we're going to dive right into it. So we're going into the DeLorean back to 1934, skipping over 1955, and we're going to be introduced into a world very different than our own. You know, World War II has not happened yet. The Japanese haven't invaded the Philippines or attacked Wake Island or bombed Pearl Harbor. The Nazis are just now becoming a prominent threat over in Europe. But all that really doesn't matter because in the United States, we're in the middle of a brutal Great Depression. And out of that Great Depression, we also happened to pass a horrible piece of legislation that ended up being a constitutional amendment that banned alcohol. Now we're going a little bit farther back in the 1920s. Outlawing alcohol allowed the rise of prominent gangsters like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, Bonnie and Clyde, and of course John Dillinger. We've all known these names from movies, mostly. John Dillinger obviously got the most recent treatment in Johnny Depp movie called Public Enemies. That had some historical accuracies and inaccuracies, of course, as movies do. Now, we're not necessarily diving into the movies themselves, but we need to understand the lead up here. What is going on? Now, as with everything back then, that is kind of the same as today. Media sensationalizes things. And back then, the way you got your press clippings wasn't through in-home television, because in-home television didn't exist yet. When you went to the movies, they would show press clippings before the previews and the movies and let you know what's going on in the world. That's where you saw a lot of the major events, right? And we've seen this represented in some movies from time to time, especially World War II films, showing what's going on in Europe and talking about different mobilizations, for instance. So this is the happenings in particular Chicago, which, you know, historically, including today, seems to have violent tendencies. Let's just put it that way. Not that us in Minneapolis, or we don't live in Minneapolis, but the people who do are exempt from that, but they do have a historical problem here. The press clippings are all about the Valentine's Day Massacre. You see all these gangsters with Tommy guns, right, with the big drum magazines. And so the impression is that machine guns have become a serious problem. Now, there was a gang problem in Chicago. Now, nationwide, it was fairly localized in New York, Chicago, some big cities. When we're talking small towns, we're not talking quite the level of a problem as you had in the major cities, very similar to today. So that was the backdrop for this. So they was passed through Congress in 1934, called the National Firearms Act. The point of this, and it became a bit of a pet project of FDR, and you got to remember FDR just passed the New Deal, very popular president, the only four-term president we have, and he was in the second term at this particular moment, he designed this to handle all firearms, not just the ones that we know today: machine guns, silencers, short-barreled rifles, any other weapons, or commonly known as AOWs, short-barrel shotguns. It was to hold all firearms, including handguns, and add them to a registry kept with the federal government. Now, at this particular time, the ATF does not exist. This is with the FBI. It was a registry of all firearms, and everyone would have to pay that $200 tax stamp that we still have to pay today. The whole point of this was sold as we're going to crack down on gangster violence. Well, there's some problems with this. The first problem we have is that, gangsters, specifically the Tommy gun, it's got the colloquial name of the Chicago typewriter, right? Well, the reality was, if you actually go to the history of auto ordnance and the creation of the Thompson, Ian McCollum did an excellent series on them. I would encourage you to go check them out. And they weren't that prominent in society. And the reason why is their price tag was right around $200. $200 back in 1934 was the equivalent to like $400 or $4,400 today. And in fact, as the inflation keeps rising, it was more closer to $5,000 today. And to put this in perspective, the average cost of a car was right around $515. So we're talking about half a car here. If we were to put this into, say, 2023, that means that for the cost of a new car, which, say, a Tesla, what is it, $45,000? Half of that, $2,250 K, that's the cost of your machine gun. So no one owned them. Not even law enforcement really owned them. There's a few larger departments that did own them, but generally speaking, they weren't well proliferated throughout society. In fact, the gangsters themselves stole them, mostly from Minnesota, actually, National Guard Armory. So they never even buy them themselves. So no one's buying these things. You got to remember, it's a depression, right? We're in the middle of a Great Depression. People don't have money. It's not something that is a necessity. And even though you can own it, no one's out in a rush to buy these things. The thing that really got FDR and his team in trouble was the handgun provision. So they ended up just cutting that thing out altogether. There is no handgun definition in the National Firearms Act. In fact, that's the problem. We're seeing that today. There's no definition of what is a handgun. All we have is short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, any other weapons, and then presumably shotguns are anything over the 18 inches, and rifles are over 16, right? So we're in this world where, and I should back up here, we're going to get to the inches count, where that came from and why, here in Chapter 2 of the National Firearms Act podcast. But this is just a very different time. So they're going after everything, and they ended up kind of stepping in it, if you will, a little bit. So much so that they decided to drop the handgun provision altogether. Said, you know what, there's too many constitutional questions on this, let's just toss it out. And that's what they did, which is a third leg on a tripod, if you will, of firearm definition that is now just gone, which brings us to today. So let's go back. Let's talk about, what is the NFA? The NFA, we all are familiar with it. You got to do fingerprinting. You got to get that passport photo. You got to submit it to the NFA branch of the ATF. Back then, it would have been the FBI. And wait to get your tax stamp back in the mail saying you can own that. And again, the $200 that we're all familiar with comes from the Thompson, actually. It was a double the cost of the Thompson. That was the idea behind it. So now you're talking about the cost of a Thompson, instead of being just $200, it's $400. Well, that's $8,000 to $10,000. No one's got it. Cost of a machine gun today, right? About $10,000 for like a Mac 10 transferable. No one's got them. That's why they're not super prevalent in society. They're more prevalent than you think, but they're not quite as prevalent as they would have had you believe back then. These things are, auto owners, for example, had 16,000 made back in 1921, and it wasn't until 1938 that they actually sold all of them. It took 20 years almost to get to that point. Just to put that in perspective. Now, we're going to take a quick pause. Again, I want to keep this to 10 minutes. I don't want to wear anyone out. We'll have a Chapter 2 of the National Firearms Act, and we'll discuss a little bit more about the $200 tax stamp.